The first verse that I want to recite to you today is from chapter 2, it's verse 117. Badi'u samawati wal ardi wa iza qada amran fa innama yaqulu lahu kun fayakun. Wonderful is the originator of the heavens and the earth. And when he decrees an affair, he says to it only, be, and it happens. The title of today's khutbah is Einstein didn't exactly get it right. So, while I recite the next few verses of the Holy Quran, I would advise you to get your A-level pure maths books out and revise on your calculus, etc. In the next verse I want to recite is from the same chapter, chapter 2, but it's verse 164. I'll just recite the English translation because it's a long verse. In the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alteration of night and day, and the ships that run in the sea, and the ships that run in the sea with that which profits men, and the water that Allah sends down from the sky, then gives life therewith to the earth after its death, and spreads in it all kinds of animals, and the changing of the winds and the clouds made subservient between heaven and earth. There are surely signs for a people of understanding. And the last verse that I want to share with you is from chapter 33, verse 62. The laws of Allah concerning what has gone before, you will find no change in those laws that Allah has created. The topic of this khutbah is Einstein didn't quite get it right. And we are not going to talk about the general theory of relativity or even the special theory of relativity to show that he didn't quite get it right. This is about a letter written by Einstein to a young guy, in which he said that the Old Testament is full of stories and tales. And he does not believe in that. And although it may actually show that there is no God, but he is, by psychology, because he was brought up in that society, a Jew. And that actually shows the importance of developing a Jamaat and a society. Because although he didn't believe in Judaism, he didn't even believe in God, he said he was brought up in this society and he belongs in it, despite that. So if you propagate Islam and don't create a Jamaat and make it strong, then when you die, so will the Jamaat. Now, the topic is he wasn't quite right, because he is right in saying that the Old Testament is full of many stories which are not correct or accurate. Let's take the example of the New Testament, which is more recent than the Old Testament. The New Testament mentions Jesus and everything that he did. But the interesting thing we find is this, that although the Romans were very keen on documenting everything, we find no mention of Jesus in any of the reports that the Roman governors sent back to Rome. I mean, if there was this man and he was creating so many problems and uproar in Palestine, then surely whoever the governor was, Pilate or whoever else it was, they would have reported back to Rome and said, in the same way as the American ambassador in Kabul and Tokyo and Berlin and whatever, report back to Washington and say, look, this is what's happening. Mrs. Merkel is going to retire and we think it's going to be so-and-so who's going to be the next Chancellor of Germany or, Prime Minister of whatever country or president. And we find no mention of Jesus at all. The first mention of Jesus we find is in a history written by a Jew called Josephus. And he refers to Jesus the Messiah. Now, does that tell you something? If Jews believed Jesus was the Messiah, they wouldn't be Jews. What would they be? Christians. So a Jew wouldn't write words, Jesus the Messiah. This, most people agree, was a much later innovation. And of course, the disciples weren't writing anything down. Why? Because Jesus said, I'm going to come back. And they hung around. And they thought, it's not going to be more than 3 or 4 days. And then they said, maybe a week, and then maybe a month, and then maybe a year. And after 40 years, when the disciples started to follow, those who'd seen Jesus started to follow Jesus up into heavens, they thought, hang on, we'd better write something down. So the earliest attempt at writing something down about Jesus was about 40, 50, 60 years after the events. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, let alone what happened 50 years ago, for me to sit down and write down what it was about. If you ask me what I had for breakfast this morning, I'll say, go and ask my wife. She made the breakfast because maybe she can remember. Yeah? Now, the other thing we've got to remember is this. The Old Testament was never written down. It was oral tradition. People would remember, in the same way as we have Hafiz of the Holy Quran, people who commit the whole of Holy Quran to memory and they recite it. Jews had exactly the same oral tradition. They had people who committed the Old Testament to memory, and then they taught others how to recite it. And then one year someone thought that, it might be a good idea to actually write everything down to make sure, because disagreements were appearing about what various books of the Old Testament said. So someone said, why don't we write this down? And 500 rabbis got together, 500 people who'd committed the whole of the Old Testament to memory. They got together and they had a meeting and they wrote everything down. And each one of them sat down separately, it is said, and wrote down what he remembered, and then they compared the notes, and they were exactly the same. You seem surprised and astonished. Yes, yes. I've never known two Muslim Maulanas to agree or anything on a single verse of the Holy Quran, let alone 500 of them sit down in single rooms and write everything down. The Old Testament is this thick, and they all agree on that. But anyway, so this was how the Old Testament came to be written down. So Einstein is quite right when he says that it's full of many things which are not believable, which may not even be correct, which may even lead you to think there is no God. And this is where he is not quite right. Because the verse of the Holy Quran that I recited to you, he is a beautiful creator. And he is so mighty and powerful that all he has to do is say, be, and it is. Initially, 40, 50, 60 years ago, there used to be two theories of creation of universe. One was called the steady state theory, which said that the universe gradually evolved. You know, the example would be a baby. A baby is born and then grows up and learns to walk and so on and so forth. And the other theory said no. What happened was that at some point in time, there was a huge explosion and the universe came into being. And this is, I suggest, what the Holy Quran is saying, that he is a great and mighty creator, and all he has to say is be. And the example is that he ordered the universe to come into being, and there was a mighty explosion, and the universe came into being. You see, the question is this. In this universe, we have cause and effect. You know, I got up in the morning and I said, I have to go to Friday prayers. So, you know, I must have a shower and I must do this and I must do that and so on and so forth. So there's cause and effect. So then we got in the car, we drove here, making sure we got here in time and all this kind of thing. The question then arises, if this universe consists of cause and effect, what or who caused that Big Bang? There must have been something there. If there wasn't something there, if there wasn't anything there, what caused that something to come into being and create that mighty explosion so that this universe came into being? And I would suggest that it was God. It was God, as the Holy Quran says, he said be, and the universe with a mighty explosion came into being. But the other thing that the Holy Quran draws our attention to is this earth. God says that in everything that you have around you, there are signs that I exist. Changing the night into day, the day into night, the seasons. Now, let's think about this. An atheist would say, well, it just so happened. It just so happened that the earth is exactly the right distance from the sun. Any closer, and we would have been roasted. Any further away, and what would have happened? We would have frozen to death. Is it just a coincidence? Is it just a coincidence that the earth is exactly the right size with the right amount of gravity so that it has this blanket, this atmosphere around it, which protects us from the harmful radiation of the sun, which provides for us oxygen and other gases apart from protecting us? That is also a coincidence. The moon is the perfect size and at a perfect distance from the earth so that we can survive. Any closer and the oceans would rise up too high for us to be able to bear it. Water is there, and the Holy Quran repeatedly refers to water. Look, when something freezes, at what point does it start freezing? from bottom upwards. Take anything. When it gets cold, when it begins to freeze, it starts at the bottom and then freezes. What happens with water? Water starts freezing from the top and goes downwards. Why is that? Why does water start freezing from the top and not from the bottom? Can anyone answer that? What is under the water? Fish. What is underwater? Plants. If it started freezing from the bottom, all the fish would die. They'll have nowhere to go. They'll come up to the top.
How can they get the oxygen then?
Sorry?
How can they get the oxygen? Because they had to come out for get the oxygen.
Yeah. But the point is, if water froze from the bottom, okay, they'll be forced up. Yeah. But it freezes at the top because they get oxygen, because oxygen is mixed in water and they absorb it through their gills. This is how it happens. And same with plants and so on. And look at another thing. When you have something up here, if I let it go, which way will it go? Up or down? It will go down. But when the plant roots absorb water, which way does water go? It goes up. In the opposite direction. So this is why this verse that I just recited to you, God says, look at animals. Look at plants, look at everything, look at seasons, look at the changing of night and day. How many of these things are going to be coincidences? Earth is at the right distance away from the sun, well, that's a coincidence. Seasons are a coincidence. The fact that water is chemically neutral and generally doesn't react with the other things, well, you can make it react obviously, but generally seas don't react with other things in them and so on, or the rainwater, etc. Is it all coincidence? You see, I find it very interesting that an atheist is happy to believe that 1 trillion coincidences caused us to be on earth as living creatures, but he is not prepared to believe that there is a supreme creator and being who planned it and created the earth and human beings and all the other animals and so on. Why is it that water has this surface tension? And this is the only liquid that has this surface tension that allows it to move up rather than down. If you restrict yourself just to human beings, think of the human brain, think of the human eye. Did you know that human eye can distinguish between 7 million colors? With perfect eyesight, a human eye can distinguish between 7 million colors. Is it just a coincidence? Human brain, the way it can argue, the way it can deduce things, the way it can save us from harm. Is it all a coincidence? But the other amazing thing is, the Holy Quran says, I've created laws. The verse is in the middle of talking about civilizations and people. But you can read this verse as, I've created these laws, they've applied in the past, and they'll continue to apply in the future. Now, man has invented rockets, and man has gone to the moon. Man has invented rockets and man has gone to Mars. This Mars rover that was guaranteed to work for 3 months, worked for 10 years. NASA were wise enough to take out that extended warranty with Curry's to make sure that if it didn't work after 3 months, Curry's will send a technician to Mars and fix it. But fortunately, it didn't happen. Are the laws any different on Mars? Are the laws any different on the moon? They tested this simple theory, which was that I know on Earth, if you have a feather and if you have a pen and you let the two of them go, the pen drops first, because the atmosphere, the air, stops the feather from dropping at the same rate. But gravity pulls it at the same rate. So when they went to the moon, they said, okay, let's test this. There's no air here. They had two things, a light thing and a heavy thing. I can't remember what they were. And they filmed it. They held them up and they let them go, and the heavy and the light mass, they both fell to the moon at the same rate, at the same time. Same thing happens on Mars, same thing happens on Venus, same thing happens wherever you go. And God tells us, I've created these laws and they're the same throughout the universe. This is also a coincidence. It's like watching an Indian movie. There are so many coincidences in Indian movies. So it's a creation of the universe appears to be the same thing. There's no creator. We're all full of coincidences that. But how can we be certain that there is a God? And Hazrat Sahib answered this. And he said, we can be certain because if we turn to Him and we speak to Him, He replies. He answers our prayers. He speaks to us. He tells us things. And we've seen this. You see, lots of people who tell you that God no longer speaks to human beings after the Holy Prophet Muhammad and so on. But we lived in homes where God spoke to our elders, who were waliullah, who were friends of Allah. My grandfather, Hazrat Maulana Abdul Haq Vidyarthi, was in Suriname. At that time, it used to take 3 months for a letter to get from Suriname to Lahore. And I think it was the day after or a couple of days after my grandmother had passed away that we got a letter from him, posted before our grandmother had died. And he said, after Tahajjud prayers, I was sitting and I saw in a vision that my wife has passed away. Is this true? How did he know? There was no possible means of communication. There was no internet. If you wanted to get a message quickly to Suriname, you would ring from Lahore to Woking. You'd have to book a call. You'll get a sort of appointment to make the call. We used to be about 24 hours away. And then you'd ring Woking. And from Woking, they would then send a telegram to Suriname. Or maybe ring someone in Holland and they would send a telegram or ring someone. So it used to take, by telephone it used to take 2 or 3 or 4 days. So how did this man know? Another time, he was on a missionary tour and he wrote a letter saying, I saw in a vision that my younger son is lost and we're all looking for him and we can't find him. Is he okay? And everyone said, yes, he's okay. So he said, oh. But that vision was about the future. He went to America, he got married there, he settled down, and one day he had a row with his wife, and he got up and left. And no one knows what happened to him or where he went. Literally everyone looked for him. The whole Jamaat in California looked for him. Chaudhry Masood Akhtar Sahib, when he got there, he looked for him. and his children, his daughter contacted me. But how did he get this vision saying that his son is lost and the whole family is looking for him and no one can find him and no one does find him? That's because God speaks to people. He tells them these things. When you pray to him, he hears you and he answers. He may not accept your prayer, but he certainly answers. And that is the most concrete proof that God exists. So, unfortunately, Einstein's dead. Otherwise, I would have invited him to today's Friday sermon and had a chat with him. But there we are. Such is life. But that is the great thing about Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, that he gave us the arguments to answer the philosophers and the atheists of this day and age. And on this I will end. Someone asked Hazrat Khwaja Kamaluddin, you go to conferences in Berlin and Paris and London and all these PhDs and philosophers and these people are there. How do you answer their objections? And he said, because I've learned answers to them by heart. And people said, how? And from where? And he said, from Mirza Sahib's books. I just have to tailor my answer to the situation. That is all that I do. But he has already given us answers to all these things. And the person who was going to do that had the right to claim to be the Messiah that had been promised to the Muslims to save them from attacks of modern philosophy.